All right, guys, let's pick up from last week. In the book, we are on, hang on. We are on page 154. We're still in the Sermon on the Mount. We finished the Beatitudes, but we're still progressing with the Sermon on the Mount. When I have read the Sermon on the Mount before, you read it, but you kind of, I don't know if gloss over is the right word, but never really thought about these verses like this before. So I feel sure some good discussion is in the coming minutes. Let's start on page 154 with Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 to 48. I like the way he does an intro before a chunk of verses. He gives you some information up front. Barclay says, this section of the teaching of Jesus is one of the most important in the whole New Testament. There are certain general things about it which we must note, and that can be condensed into Jesus speaking with an authority which no other man had ever dreamed of assuming. He didn't say, he said things with the air of, I say it, not God through me says it, or like prophets and other traveling preachers would say things that someone else said. He said it as if it was coming from him, which is exactly why it got him in trouble with the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin Council. Farther down on 154, it says, to the Jews, the law was absolutely holy and absolutely divine, couldn't be tweaked, couldn't be reworded. Those who deny the law is from heaven have no part in the world to come, they believed at the top of 155. The first act of every synagogue service is to take the rolls of the law from the Ark of the Covenant in which they're stored, and they carry them around the congregation. And I'm sorry. Okay. They carry the rolls around the congregation that the congregation might show their reverence for the rolls. Sort of like, I guess, when we put our hand on the Bible and swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Does anybody know if they actually kiss the Torah scrolls, or do they just walk them around the synagogue? I've been to a bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah, but
I've been to one worship service. Went with Cindy actually to a Friday night worship service in one of the synagogues close to the Fan, and I remember them. It was quite ceremonial, the marching in of the scrolls. I don't remember them going all the way around the room. They just came down the aisle, the center aisle. I don't remember anybody kissing them.
Do they, when they say
it might depend on whether it's Reformed, Orthodox, or conservative. And there's a part of the ritual in many Episcopal churches, because there's levels of ritual in Episcopal churches, and but the Bible is carried in as part of the processional in for the service.
Well, when they mention they take them out, this says they take them out of the ark. Does every synagogue have a replica of the ark with the 4 angels on the corners and all of that? Literally a replica from the Old Testament?
That I don't think so. It's more like an enclosed cabinet.
Okay. I was just curious because it said the ark. So I guess they just mean it as a storage area. All right, on page 155, it says, no fewer than 5 times in Matthew, Jesus quotes the law only to contradict it and substitute a teaching of his own. Now imagine if Cindy did that in front of us. He claimed the right to point out the inadequacies of the most sacred writings in the world and to correct them out of his own wisdom. He didn't argue about what he said. He didn't seek in any way to justify himself or to seek to prove he was right. He didn't say, what do y'all think about that? He just tweaked the law, reworded it, gave it new meaning or depth. And it's Barclay says, no one had ever heard anything like this before. Like prophets would say, thus says the Lord. A characteristic phrase of scribes and rabbis was, there is a teaching that. They made sure that nobody interpreted them as saying it. Jesus made a statement that required no authority other than the fact that he made it. He was his own authority. So before we read Matthew 5:21-48, notice that Jesus speaks with authority and doesn't ask anybody if they agree with him. I had never been presented with that before, nor did I really realize he sort of changed some of the rules, expanded on them. Do you guys already knew that or no?
Well, he says it. He says the Bible, you have heard that you don't murder. Okay, you don't kill. But I tell you, you don't even think about it. Okay, so I think we all heard that.
Yeah, that's true.
Really
I never really thought about it.
I'm telling you, don't even think about it, or don't covet your neighbor's possessions or wife or whatever. But I tell you, if you even think about it, that's an issue. So I think that I saw it kind of changing the rules, right? Or making us think about it a completely different way.
Right.
Well, I remember when I was younger, and it says if you think something in your head, it's just as bad as doing it. And I have to tell you, I said to myself, nah, that's not right. I mean, thinking about hurting somebody and actually punching them in the face is not the same thing.
But it's the first step.
Well, yeah. At the top of 156, it says no ordinary person would dare make such a claim. So Jesus has a new standard that he's putting before men and women that was very startling. This was something entirely new for the people of that day. And it says in Jesus's teaching, thoughts are just as important as deeds. And it's not enough to commit a sin. The only thing that's enough is to wish to commit the sin. It was Jesus's teaching that we are not judged only by our deeds, but we are judged even more by the desires which never emerge in deeds. And people don't know what you're thinking. I mean, we don't have little message boxes up here. If they did, we'd be in a lot of trouble.
Unless you're on the internet, on
Do
social.
what?
Often people with the little text with Twitter and everything else, they often say what they say, what's in their mind before they think about what they're saying out loud.
Yeah. Jesus is intensely concerned with our thoughts. Wow. He does say there's a part of us that's attracted to good and a part of us that's attracted to evil. And on page 158, he talks about reason versus passion. So reason is the logical side, thinking side of you, and passion is the side of us that gets us in trouble, where we say things before we think, like Susan just said, or we do things before we really think it all the way through. And I guess the problem with passion is, with reason, you're in your right mind, you're thinking, and it's like, it's not worth it, just don't say anything. But with passion, it's almost like you lose your self-control, and that's made worse with drugs and alcohol and other things, to the point sometimes where people do and say things in the heat of the moment and they don't even realize what they've done.
Kitten.
Yeah.
I've always sort of divided things into thoughts, words, and deeds. And I think technology has given us a fourth venue, and that is the internet and the web. And I think the anonymity of the internet, people think they can act out however they want to, and it doesn't really count because nobody can put a name or a face to it. And if you've ever watched that show To Catch a Predator, those people who were sending the messages, it's like they're shocked when they get there and the police are there, because they didn't think it really counted because it was on the internet.
Yeah, but that's attached to an ID. It might not be your name, but it's your whatever handle you're using to go by.
It's this fantasy world, and it's like what people used to think about. They thought they think now they have an avenue where they can do things without being held accountable for it. And it's not just the pedophiles, but it's the snarky, nasty comments and stuff that people post because they think they can get away with it.
Yeah, I'm really shocked about the stuff I've read on the internet in the political season. and it is attached to people's names. And I'm like, ooh, a lot of times I might agree with something, but I just scroll on by. I'm not putting that on my Facebook page, you know? I don't know.
It's, that's how we get the increase in bullying and everything. I mean, with technology has really escalated that.
Mhm.
And it was bad enough, Claire, before we had the internet. I mean, I don't know any kid in elementary and middle school that wasn't bullied. Everybody was bullied by somebody. I mean, if you weren't ugly, you were too pretty. If you weren't dumb, you were too smart. If you weren't a good athlete, you were a bad athlete. So it's, either way, it's,
Yeah.
you're doomed if you're
But-
good, you're doomed if you're bad.
But one thing technology has done away with, I can remember getting sexually inappropriate phone calls,
Oh, yeah.
and caller ID stopped them in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
So that is a positive side to some of it.
And
In
now
the
they
middle,
send you nasty text messages.
Yeah.
Ken, I
in
want to
the-
go back to what you were saying, you were asking earlier about, realizing how Jesus was challenging things and how he did things. Because I will have to say that in the course of our studies in the Sojourners class, really becoming aware of how radical Jesus was.
I did not realize that.
Yeah, it just, learning and radical, that what he said about God's love and how we are to behave and treat each other, how radical that was, and how what he challenged us to do.
But don't you think that's exactly what pulled people into early Christianity?
Oh yeah, and I think it still is.
And
Because
it's
they could find a place to belong even if they were badly damaged people.
And that's what Christianity should be about.
Yeah, I agree.
but it was
Other
also
thoughts?
he was crucified.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, on page 158, he talks about your outward actions versus your inner thoughts. And all of us, he says in here, everyone's had inappropriate inner thoughts, and we're lucky if they don't become outward actions. And most people, part of your maturing is being able to control your outward actions. And he says, number 3 on page 158, every one of us is in default. We all fall short. Any other thoughts before we start this section? That's the pre-description. All right, if somebody would read Matthew 5:21 and 22, 2 little verses.
I got it.
Thanks.
You have heard that it was said by the people of the old days, you shall not kill. And whoever kills is liable to the judgment court. But I say unto you that everyone who is angry with his brother is liable to the judgment court. And he who says to his brother, you brainless one, is liable to judgment in the Supreme Court. And he who says to his brother, you fool, is liable to be cast into the Gehenna of fire.
So he takes a simple commandment, thou shalt not kill, and basically says, if you think it, it's the same as if you have done it, and you will be judged, and you will be thrown in Gehenna is hell. And he spends quite a bit of time explaining that. It says Jesus lays down that even anger against another person is forbidden. And it's nothing less than a total prohibition of anger. And then he explains that by saying, if it's a flash in the pan, if it's something where you get angry with someone, you flash up, you calm down, I'm sorry, I really didn't mean that. He's not talking about that. He's talking about an anger from 23 years ago where somebody wronged you. You're nursing it, you're feeding it, you're thinking about it. It's that kind of, he's not talking about at the top of 160, an anger that rises speedily and just as speedily passes. He's talking about an anger that has become deep rooted. That anger is liable in the judgment court. And Jesus condemns all selfish anger. I loved what in the middle of 160, Seneca was a philosopher, a thinker back in Rome from 4 BC to 65 AD. And it says, Seneca called anger a brief insanity. I love that, because people do things when they are in the heat of anger or drunk or high or whatever, and sometimes don't even remember that they did it. And if they don't capture it on film or have witnesses who can recall what happened, some people would never really realize how badly they had acted. I have told my Sunday school class on several occasions about Carla Faye Tucker, the last woman to be put to death in Texas for murder. She and her boyfriend were drunk and high, golly, it's been 30, 40 years ago now, in Texas, and killed a couple they found parking in the woods. Just for the heck of it. I don't think they stole anything. They just killed them. And because they were drunk and high, had they not been covered in blood and found out, they didn't even realize they had killed this couple. And both of them ended up dying, I guess, in the electric chair. But Carla Faye Tucker, because it took her so long to go through all her appeals, created a prison ministry because she realized how far off the path she had gotten. And she converted hundreds of people to Christianity in prison and had one of the most successful prison ministries that there was, yet she still died. Sort of like the Green Mile. Has everybody seen the Green Mile? Oh, what a wonderful movie. But Carla Faye Tucker did that in Texas. She created a horrific murder that she did not even remember because she and her boyfriend were drunk and high at the time. But she ended up creating a ministry that did good for hundreds of people. So right below the Seneca statement, it says, Jesus forbids forever the anger that broods, the anger that won't forget, the anger that refuses to be pacified, the anger that seeks revenge. And imagine how much horror has been done in the world because people were seeking revenge for some perceived or actual hurt. Anger turns into insulting words. And then he talks about the sin of insult. Anger in a person's heart and anger in a person's speech are equally forbidden. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I feel like when I'm reading Barclay, I feel like I should just stay home.
Me too. Yeah.
I would be much safer just staying home.
Well, as I divulged last week, I'm not one of those to hold it in and fester. When I'm angry with someone, they're going to know within seconds because I'm going to tell them. But I have to get it out and deal with it and then move on because life is too full of stuff. I can't imagine pulling out this drawer. Well, my aunt said so-and-so, and this drawer, my husband said so-and-so, and good Lord, who can keep up with all of that foolishness? I can't. I just have to deal with it. All right, we're sorry, move on. On page 161, it says, the person who despises another with an arrogant contempt is condemned. And then if you call them an idiot, a silly fool, an empty-headed blunderer, that's contempt because you're putting yourself above them.
I'm with Sarah. I'm in trouble.
Me too. Me
Nancy
too.
and I can just stay together.
Yeah. But we're all at fault. We all fall short. So this is for all of us.
Thank God for grace.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. And that Jesus came to be a living sacrifice for our sin because we sin every hour probably of every day. Down at the bottom, it talks about the Sanhedrin Council, the Supreme Court of the Jews, and the Sanhedrin Council is the council that condemned Jesus to death. And I think the one in Jerusalem, it's usually 3 people in a little town, 23 people in a medium-sized town, and 71 men in a big city like Jerusalem. So the Sanhedrin Council in Jerusalem was probably the 71 version. And Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus were they're the only 2 I've ever heard mentioned in the Bible that were on the Sanhedrin Council who were followers of Jesus. I always wondered if they voted no when the council voted. Did Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus actually vote no? We don't agree with this, but we'll never know.
I didn't realize that they would have been part of that body.
Yeah, well, it says in the Bible, it says, it's as if Jesus said, the sin of deep-rooted anger is bad, but the sin of contempt is worse, because I guess you putting yourself above someone else. It's bad enough to be mad with someone that you consider an equal, but once you lift yourself to a higher level and put yourself in contempt of them, I guess it's worse because you're elevating yourself at their expense. Am I reading that right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
All right, on page 162, it talks about you can have contempt because your pride of the family you were born into, your position in the community, the amount of money you make, the material things you possess, the knowledge in your head. He lists some things at the top of 162 that can cause us to speak to others with contempt. Anyone care to speak on any of those? I think beauty could be in there too. Some people are like peacocks preening, you know, all of my value is in my appearance.
I've always felt sorry for those people because
If
that
they,
doesn't last.
yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah,
Well, and you know, I used to be real proud of reading and studying and learning, and my grandma and my mom both got dementia, so you know, that passes too.
yeah, it all passes.
Yeah. I think that's the point, Sarah.
Yeah.
Number 3 on page 162, he talks about moral fools, people who live immoral lives. And we've had this discussion in the fellowship class often, that I guess we find some sense of comfort in the fact that, well, I don't murder anybody, and I don't commit adultery, and I don't steal, and you know, but there's so many small things that are like water wearing away limestone. They almost are worse over time. Jesus says that anyone who destroys another's name and reputation is liable to the most severe judgment of all. But I kept reading, and he explains later, if you wrongly destroy another's reputation and liable, if they have done you wrong, you're to take them to court and get a settlement. But you can't besmirch people's reputations wrongly. That's, he says, is liable to the most severe judgment of all. And then he talks about Gehenna.
Advertising.
Say that again, bud.
That cuts out political advertising.
You know, I always wonder where they get that stuff from. You know, is what they're saying true or just literally made up?
Nobody's any good. That, you know, doesn't make a difference where they are.
Well, but we're no better. I mean, we would have faults to be dug up as well. You know, I don't know. You wonder that anybody runs for political office knowing they're going to dig that mess up. At the bottom of 162, he talks about Gehenna and how, and it is hell. It's just another word for hell. And he talks about a valley nearby where, if you go back and read Kings, King Ahaz, who was horrible, worshiped the pagan god Molech. And we've talked in our Sunday school class when we did Kings and Chronicles. Molech was the god that they sacrificed children to. And I don't know that there's anything worse than sacrificing children. So at the time Jesus was alive, the valley of Gehenna, the valley of Hinnom, is where they burned refuse. There was always smoking and stinky and dirty, and it's just where they burned trash and waste from the city. So when Jesus said, destroying other people's good reputation is you be thrown into the valley of or into Gehenna. Let me go back and see what it says.
Liable to be cast into the Gehenna.
Liable to be cast into the Gehenna of fire, the hell of fire. Everybody in Jerusalem would know what that was, because the valley of Hinnom was to the southwest of Jerusalem, like within walking distance. So everybody would know what that was, like a public incinerator, he says in here. So Jesus insists that the gravest thing of all is to destroy someone's reputation and take that person's good name away. He didn't mean saying bad things about bad people, which we probably shouldn't do that either, but he says it's horrible to ruin someone's good reputation. It's a hell-deserving sin. Down at the bottom of 163, it says, I tell you that not only are your outward actions under judgment, your inmost thoughts are also under the scrutiny and judgment of God. Because if you think it, you are a murderer at heart. I don't really like that. Doesn't make it less true, but I don't like it.
We'll edit that out.
Do what?
I said we'll edit that out.
I mean, I somehow I just, because I'm a science person, most of my head is black and white. I don't have a lot of gray area. I need things to be clear, to be black and white. And I absolutely do not believe thinking about killing somebody.
But all of science is about taking gray.
Well, true, but you're trying to get to an area of clarity. You don't want to stay in the gray area. You want to get to clarity. I don't think killing somebody, I mean, thinking about hurting someone is as bad as actually hurting them. But Jesus says I'm wrong. Who knew?
Well, when I read this, some of y'all know, my first husband was gay and didn't bother to tell me until, anyway, I didn't want to kill him, but I wanted him to die.
I understand that.
A car accident, he didn't have to stop. I can remember literally praying to God, you need to make sure you behave here. But I can remember praying to God, kill him.
Yeah.
Because back then we thought it was a choice.
Right.
And it did horrible things to me because he was the only guy that I'd ever dated, which made me think there was something bad wrong with me. So I went into a very, very dark place and would pray to God to please kill this man and take this off my plate because I didn't know what to do with it.
Yeah. I prayed for God to kill my dad too, when he was in a drunken rage and hitting us and tearing the house up. Yeah, I prayed for that too. And then Daddy, golly, 25 years ago, apologized to me. He walked me down to the pond behind the house and held my hand like I was 8. And he apologized to me, and it made it okay. It really did. It allowed us to have a relationship. I was amazed that I was able to just let it go. He didn't remember any of it. I mean, he really, he didn't remember. I mean, he'd wake up the next day and want to know who did all that stuff. And we're like, really?
Mm-hmm.
On
Some
page
of this is why Jesus was said to be Essenian in his philosophy. Because, it's Essenians, of course, everything physical is not good, everything spiritual is. So just by having thoughts and spiritual, that's sort of Essenian thought. And some theologians have felt that Christ was very influenced by the Essenians.
Thank you, Harold. Something else to think about. Let's move on to Matthew 5, 23 and 24 on page 164. Someone read?
I'll read it.
Thank you, Kathy.
So then, if you bring your gift to the altar, and if you there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go and be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift.
Barclay says that Jesus is reminding the Jews of a principle that they would know very well, that you can't be right with God if you're not right with your fellow man. The sacrifice is meant to be the cure that restores your relationship with God, but you can't do that if you've got issues with, other people. Now, he also, in the second paragraph there, says that these sacrifices were never meant to atone for deliberate sin. This is only for accidental sin or, we spent some time in fellowship one time talking about the difference in the commandment when it says thou shalt not murder. It doesn't say thou shalt not kill. If you accidentally were to hit a pedestrian or somebody on a bicycle, that's not the same as deliberate pre-thought murder. So it's saying here that sacrifices in the temple do not atone for deliberate sin. And I think we all understand that. Secondly, sacrifice has to include confession of sin and true penitence. You have to be really sorry and do something to show that you are. Breaches between human beings and God could not be healed until human beings reconciled their differences. I've come to church a lot of times with issues on my heart with other people. I've never really thought about that before. Does anybody know if the Catholics believe that too, that you have to go to confession and reveal your sins and get forgiven and do your penance before you go to worship? Didn't people go to confession right before worship?
I remember as a kid, confession, at least my mother said that they would go to confession Saturday night. And then church was Sunday morning. So there might be something to that.
We drove my grandma to church Sunday morning in Lawrenceville, and there wasn't a church for the longest time. They built a very, very small one in the 70s, and grandma came to live with us in 74. And going home from church one day, I was like 14, 15. I mean, we drive in the country way before we're 16. I ran out of the road, just hit the gravel, and my grandmother goes, "Get in the road, you little shit." And I'm like, "Grandma," and she said, "Oh, I'll get it at confession next week." And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, it can't be that easy."
Oh,
It's not supposed to be that easy.
I know, but my grandma was in her 70s and was still talking about, "I'll get it at confession next week."
But I've heard Bernie McDonald.
Protestants do that too.
I know.
But Bernie McDonald grew up Catholic, and there have been many times in our class that he would say the Catholic faith is very, very easy. It's just 1, 2, 3. They tell you exactly what to do, how to do it, when to do it. You do it and you're good.
In Latin.
Do what? In Latin. Well, they even created purgatory. So if you died as a sinner, you could sort of go there in limbo and do some penance, or people could pray you out or some such. I'm not sure about the rules,
In the
but
Middle Ages, you can pay, to
Yes.
get your relatives out.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, and there were Catholics praying to get dead Jews out too. Remember the Mormons? And some Catholics were praying to get Jews out of hell so they could go to heaven. And I'm like, what? That's ridiculous. So, yeah. It's at the top of 165. It says people had to do their utmost to put things right with themselves before they could be right with God. And I've never really thought about that before coming to church on Sunday morning. The sacrifice in back in Jesus's day, it says the sacrifice was substitutionary. The sacrifice you brought to the temple, they said the people literally put their hand on the head of the dove or the lamb or the animal, and they literally believed they were transferring their sin to the animal, that they stand at there was the gate of the court of the Gentiles, the court of the women, court of the men, and then you got to the court of the priests where the men couldn't go. So you stood at this fence, this border, and you handed your animal over. And when the priest was holding it, you put your hands on the head of the animal and said prayers that transferred, "I'm sorry for, hitting my child, cussing my wife, whatever." And you transfer the sin to the animal, and then the priest goes and sacrifices the animal, and your sin transferred, which I think for them was probably very, very good, because you physically believe your sin transfers to the animal that you're going to sacrifice.
Then Jesus came along and stepped things up a notch or two.
Yes, he did. So he spends some time on page 165 talking about how back then the sacrifice of the animal was substitutionary for your sins. If any sacrifice was to be valid, confession and restoration were involved. And that's true today. If you want to restore yourself with a friend or a family member or coworker that you've wronged, somebody's got to confess it and try to do better. The worshiper did not make his own sacrifice. He brought it to the priest.
Doesn't that relate to the crucifixion, the sacrificial lamb?
Mhm.
We're getting really deep here.
Well, I remember the first time in Sunday school as an adult, we talked about the reason in the Apostles' Creed. It talks about Jesus descended into hell and then he rose. And while he was in hell, he was there for 3 days because he had the weight of the sin of the world on him and he couldn't be in God's presence when he had our sin on him. I never thought about that before, but that's a good point, Bud. When Jesus was sacrificing himself on the cross, the weight of our sin is what he was carrying, and he couldn't be in God's presence in that human form full of sin. So it says in the Apostles' Creed that he descended into hell, and then after 3 days he arose, and I
Yeah, but-
assume left the sin in hell.
Yeah, let's remember about who made up these creeds and when they were made up though. You know, they're not biblical.
Right,
You know,
right.
they have no biblical basis whatsoever. So,
Right.
you know, let's not forget that. And even the sacrificial lamb is a philosophical concept that was sort of brought in the Middle Ages. I think Christ never talked in those terms. So, you know, a lot of this we just have to weed through of, well, like I've said, we've been making up Christianity for 2,000 years.
Yeah.
So,
Well, to Sarah's point, thank you, Harold. To Sarah's point, the Catholic Church makes it easy. Well, to Bernie's point, I guess. And I think I grew up Methodist, so I grew up learning the Apostles' Creed. And I guess they create the creeds to make it easy for you to understand how or why things happened. And then as an adult, you figure it out. Yeah. At the bottom of 165, he concludes this section by saying, Jesus is quite clear about this basic fact. We cannot be right with God until we are right with one another. So we'll leave it at that. All right, 941. Let's see if we can do one more section. Matthew 5, 25 and 26. Do we have a reader?
Yeah, I'll do it.
Thank you.
Get on to good terms again with your opponent while you are still on the road with him, in case your opponent hands you over to the judge and the judge hands you over to the court officer and you can be cast into prison. This is the truth I tell you. If that happens, you certainly will not come out until you have paid the last penny.
Well, I never knew that there was a procedure or practice 2,000 years ago where under Greek law, the plaintiff could arrest the defendant and haul him into court. If you got a court day and time, you grabbed the person by the cloak and you literally dragged them into court. So both of you could be seen on the road together going into court. So if you knew you had wronged him and you didn't want to get pulled into court and get locked up, it was in your own best interest to satisfy your debt with whoever you owed, whatever it was, before he grabs you by the cloak and drags you into court. It says on page 167, crimes for which a man might summarily be arrested were things like thieving, clothes stealing, because clothes stealers were a curse in the public bathhouses of ancient Greece. Never thought about that before. Pickpockets, housebreaking, kidnapping, and it wasn't kidnapping of family members for ransom. It was kidnapping of especially gifted and accomplished slaves, like a good baker, a good, I don't know, steward of some sort. Very eye-opening. These are things that someone could come to you and haul you into court. And if you had done these things, you'd be found guilty and they were going to lock you up. So it was in your own best interest to clear up these things before you got hauled into court. But that was Greek law. And it says it's much more likely that Jesus would be thinking in terms of Jewish law, but this is obviously a case about debt. Somebody owes somebody something, and you would have been hauled over to the Council of Elders, which is like the Sanhedrin Council, only smaller. In a small town, it would have been 3. In a medium-sized town, 23. But still, it worked on the same principle. Jesus's advice may mean one of two things. It might be practical advice, just save yourself the hassle and pay your debt before you get hauled into court. or on page 168, it might mean put things right with your neighbors while your life lasts, because you could die before you set things right and go to hell. And I know we talk about, you know, you need to do certain things before, because you don't know, you're not promised another day. We all should get things right before the end of our life. And I mean, we all know family members who don't speak, don't get along, you know, for whatever reason, and they die that way. They never do resolve the issues. What happens, do you think, if you're wrong and you make amends to apologize, but the person you're seeking amends from doesn't grant it? Or sort of like Judas, when Judas went back to the person he got the money from, and I don't remember, was that person a Sanhedrin Council member or a priest or a scribe or a Pharisee? I can't remember now who Judas got the money from, but he took it back and threw it and said, I have committed a sin, I've betrayed innocent blood. He was remorseful and sorry, but the person he asked forgiveness from said, this is dirty money, I can't take it, it's blood money. In other words, he did not forgive Judas. Did Judas go to heaven or hell? He was not forgiven.
I always thought Judas's sin, though, was not accepting the forgiveness, other than, of course, the betrayal, was not accepting the forgiveness of Christ.
I'm not sure I understand what you mean, Claire. When did Jesus forgive him?
Well, he would have been, Jesus would have forgiven him for anything.
True, true.
So,
But he never asked Jesus for forgiveness. He asked the priest for forgiveness.
right, and that's where the sin would lie. Would it not, asking a human for forgiveness?
Oh,
Yeah.
Gotcha.
But that's not where the forgiveness really needs to come from. You know, plus that priest had his own role in it because he gave Judas the money to start with.
But Judas sought the money to betray Jesus too.
But he was, the priest gave him
Right.
the money.
Right. So I believe Judas went to heaven because I wrote a term paper on it in college.
Well, that settles it.
Judas has always bothered me because Judas is me. You know, when I go back to someone and I'm saying I'm sorry, I've had people say, I'm not forgiving you for that.
Well, what did he do afterwards?
He hung himself. He killed himself.
Right. Isn't that somewhat repentant?
I think so, Harold, but I could be wrong. I always believed that Judas saved himself when he repented. He took the money back. He said, I made a big mistake. I'm sorry. But the priest refused to forgive him. So in my opinion, the sin transferred from Judas to the priest who refused to forgive a repentant parishioner, for lack of a better word. But I could be totally wrong. Judas might be in hell.
I agree with your thesis.
Mhm.
I think that we would meet Judas in heaven.
Yeah. I think no matter what you do, Judas played a role. And Jesus knew he was going to play that role because he said, the man who dips the bread in the, in the cup with me will betray me.
Isn't there amongst the Apocrypha a Gospel of Judas that suggests that Jesus and Judas kind of were in the big plan together, and that Judas had a role to play to make it turn out the way it did?
Right. Well,
I think, well, that was written, it's what's called a non-canonical book.
Right.
It was written quite some time after Jesus or after the New Testament. And so to me, I look at it as sort of another layer of speculation of trying to figure it out. I mean, that's a lot of what Christianity is trying to figure out how this all works.
let me end with another big question, just because I want all y'all to have something to think about this week. What if two people sin, neither one approaches the other one for forgiveness, and they just go on with life? We just move forward.
I think it's up to God.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's, do they even knew that they sinned?
Mm.
Well, if you don't know you've sinned, is it a sin?
Well, I know when I sin, so
Right, I understand, but sometimes,
I know.
I mean, isn't that part of it being a sin that you know you've done something wrong?
Can you
and
give me
there
an
would be-
example of something where you might sin and you wouldn't know it's a sin?
Sometimes I have offended someone and not realized I've offended them.
Well, that's true, but these days people take offense at all manners of things that aren't meant to be offensive. So I don't know that I see that as a sin.
I mean, you can
When
actually,
I say something to somebody, I mean to be offensive, typically. You know, I know, we all know. Um, and I'm usually sorry later, but I'll tell you, I'll come and tell you.
She doesn't have a mute button.
So, well, what happens, to Sarah's point? What happens when you,
I'm worried about Tom now.
Tom's fine.
Sarah, what do you think? Answer your own question. What do you think? Do you think if you say something and it might be a sin and you don't think it's a sin, what?
I think intent is what makes it a sin. So if it's not your intention, then you're okay. But you know, it's just personal.
So if
Yeah.
I walk up to you, Sarah, and say, "Oh, Sarah, you look different in that dress today,"
That didn't mean anything.
am I intending to offend you or not?
If it's not your intent, then you haven't sinned. I may take offense, but it doesn't mean that you've sinned because you weren't intending to.
But in your own mind, you might have been.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
Well,
but God
you know,
knows
all
the
right, so let's think back to this
How
passage.
can I interact with anybody on any level? How can I speak, look, walk, do anything?
in love.
Well, Michael says God knows your
God knows
heart.
your intentions.
He
so.
knows
Right,
what
I
you
mean,
intend.
I'm with Michael. You know, what
Yeah.
Jesus is just telling us in these verses is what's in your heart is what
Right.
counts.
At the end of the day, it's not between me and you, it's between me and God. So
Yep.
Yeah.
Being a teacher, I'm always trying to correct others. And Michael says, "Whoa, God's got it. Just hold up there, kitten. God's got it."
she's not in charge of the whole world.
I think I'm in charge of him and his behavior. He
You're
says
the
God's
first-
got it. So
You're
I
the
have to let
firstborn.
it go. Yeah.
Yeah.
A-type personality, firstborn. Yeah.
Yeah,
I could
yeah,
rule
yeah.
the world if they just give me a scepter.
Yep, you and me both.
Yeah.
And-
All right, guys. Next week, we're going to continue with the Sermon on the Mount. We're not done. Next week.
Oh no, we got 2 more chapters to go.
Yeah. Who teaches next week? Because that you get to do adultery and sex then. Woohoo! Glad I missed that one. All right. Come back next week for more good stuff. See you in 5 minutes.